Hello there, I'm Alex, and I sell cheese for a living. As a cheesemonger and certified cheese professional, I have helped thousands of customers find their favorite cheese. Each week, I'll share what I've learned from behind the counter as we dive into the vast, fascinating world of all things cheese. Welcome back to the Modern Monger podcast. This is usually the show where we dive into the big world of cheese. But today we're going to take a slightly different educational direction and touch on charcuterie. And I'm not talking about just Instagram boards or grazing tables you're used to seeing online. We're going to go a little deeper. We're going to talk about the history, the cultural impact, why charcuterie has exploded so much in popularity lately, and how it all connects back to what we love most here, cheese. And just to say it up front, this is still, first and foremost, a cheese-based podcast. But the truth is, and I've said this a few times before, cheese doesn't exist in just a vacuum. It loves to have friends on any plate. Meats, wines, breads, pickles, all of these things help us understand cheese better by giving it context. They highlight the flavors, create contrast, and make each bite more complete. So, I would argue the more you learn about charcuterie, the more you will understand cheese as well. And that's what we're going to be doing today. So let's start at the beginning. Charcuterie, at its core, is preservation. Long before refrigeration, ancient civilizations had one big problem. Much like milk, how do you make meat last? In regions across Europe, particularly in what is now France, Italy, and Spain, people began curing, salting, smoking, and drying meats as a way to extend their shelf life. Pork quickly became the centerpiece here. It was versatile, widely available, and incredibly adaptable to different preservation techniques. Salt, again, is the key, as it pulled moisture out of the meat, creating an environment where harmful bacteria could not survive. From there, more methods evolved. Air drying in mountain climates, smoking over wood fires, fermenting with naturally occurring bacteria. What started as survival turned into craft, and eventually art. A lot of the origins of charcuterie will mirror the origins of cheese, if not from different countries and or from different necessities needing to be met. But all good food eventually comes into the modern era as a craft and an art, whereas they usually all started off as survival needs needing to be met. Before we go any further, let's slow down for a second and really understand what charcuterie actually is. Not the boards, not the presentation, but the craft itself. At its core, charcuterie is about preserving meat. Long before refrigeration existed, people needed ways to make meat last longer than a few days. We've heard this before. So across different parts of the world, especially in Europe, they developed techniques to extend the life of their food. And the tools were very simple: salt, air, and time. I guess you would also need the cut of meat, but the tools outside of the meat are salt, air, and time. Salt being the most important, as it draws moisture out of the meat. And without the moisture, harmful bacteria struggle to survive. From there, people began experimenting, drying the meats in open air, smoking them over a fire, and eventually allowing controlled fermentation to develop deeper flavors. And this is where charcuterie shifts from the necessity phase into the crafty phase, where you're getting a little more artisanal with your product. Now, not all charcuterie is the same. There are a few main categories, and understanding these will help you out quite a bit. First, whole muscle meats. These are exactly what they sound like. It's going to be a single intact cut of meat that's been cured. Think of prosciutto, jamon, bresaola, coppa, capicola. Though these tend to highlight the natural qualities of the meat itself, the breed of the animal and what it was fed, how it was raised, and where it was cured. They are often simple in ingredients, but very expressive in origin. Second, we're going to look at forced meats. This is where things get a little more complex. Forced meats are made by breaking down the meat, mixing it in with salt, spices, maybe fat, sometimes wine or other flavorings, and then reforming it, often into sausages like salami or soppressata, or spreads like pate. This category allows for a little bit more creativity, as you're not just preserving a whole chunk of meat, you are breaking it down and then adding in more flavorings and then reshaping it how you want it to be shaped. You really channel a lot of flavor in a forced meat category item. And then there's a third category that sits somewhere in between a whole muscle and a forced meat. And this is going to be something like a finely processed or emulsified meats like mortadella. These are often smoother, more uniform, and should have a softer, more approachable texture. Now, how is all of this actually made? At a basic level, most charcuterie comes down to a few key ingredients, and from there, you can add your spices, your herbs, your sugars, your curing agents, depending on the style. And the process can include dry curing, where salt is rubbed onto the meat and it slowly loses moisture over time, or wet curing, where the meat is submerged in a brine, or smoking, where flavor and preservation happen all together. On fermentation, this is going to be where beneficial bacteria create acidity, adding both safety and complexity. And one thing that often surprises people, the cut of the animal absolutely matters, but not maybe in the way you'd expect. For whole muscle charcuterie, the cut of meat is everything. A ham becomes prosciutto. A loin might become lonza. A beef eye round can become bresaola. The texture, fat content, and the muscle structure all influence the final product. You can't just use any cut of ham or any cut of pork and call it prosciutto. It has to come from the specific ham of the pig. But if you look at forced meats, you get a lot more flexibility. Different cuts can be used together. You can combine them with different fat to achieve a desired texture and flavor. Their ratios are all different. And I think the type of fat added into the forced meats is also a big indicator of quality. If you just have the trimmings and scraps of what's left over from, your butchered hog, there's a difference between just using the scraps of fat and perhaps just a big old slab of pork belly. It's going to taste different. And I'm not sure what all some of the more popular ratios are off the top of my head, but I do know the better cut of fat off of an animal mixed with the better cuts of the animal on separate body parts mixed all together, that's going to make a better salami. Versus you get into some hot dog territory when they just start throwing in every random piece of the animal and then it pops out a salami tube. It's not going to horrible, and depending on the spices and the way they cure it, it could be a very delicious product. But I would think this goes for every food product out there, the better quality cuts make a better quality product in the end. Not a very hot take. It seems common sense, but something people maybe don't think about all the time. Now, we will also in future episodes go into more deep dives on specific cuts, like there may be a prosciutto episode and a chorizo episode. But for now, that is a good enough start to get you on your road to understanding how charcuterie meats are made. And now we're going to talk about a little more of the history and where they came from around the world. In the past, as trade routes expanded, so did charcuterie. Techniques moved across borders, spices were introduced, regional identities began to form. Italy developed prosciutto and salami traditions. Spain refined jamon. France elevated charcuterie into a culinary discipline. Charcuterie became more than food preservation. It became a reflection of culture, geography, and time. In colder climates, longer curing times created deeper, more complex flavors. In warmer regions, spices and fermentation played a bigger role. And as cities grew, so did the demand for ready-to-eat preserved foods. This shift helped shape how people ate. Meals became more flexible. Snacking culture began to emerge. Food became something to share, not just consume. And importantly, charcuterie and cheese grew up together. They were natural companions. Salt, fat, acid, and texture are things that all work well together. Even today, that relationship is at the heart of what I do. If we fast forward to the modern day, charcuterie is everywhere. But this didn't happen overnight. And I don't think it's because people suddenly decided cured meats would look nice on a wooden board. I think there are a few deeper meanings behind this big boom. And once you see them, it'll start to make a lot more sense. First up, we're going to look at the accessibility of it. Charcuterie products remove a lot of barriers since there's no cooking required. There's no strict technique you have to master before you can participate. You can walk into any shop, pick out a few meats, a few cheeses, maybe something crunchy or brined or sweet, and you've created something on a board that feels very powerful because beautiful food on a board makes you feel more capable. Charcuterie, for presentation purposes, is visual in a way that most food isn't. You're not plating just a single dish. You're going to create an art piece on wood. You're creating a landscape. You're going to play with different colors, textures, shapes. You can fold the meat, slice the meat, you can chunk the meat. You can do all the same things to cheeses. You can nestle in between the cheeses and the meats, little pockets of fruit. And you can't forget the nuts and spreads. And in the age of social media, this is where you can get a lot of attention on the art you make. People don't just want food that tastes good anymore. They want food that looks like an experience, a story with the eyes before they even eat it. And charcuterie delivers that almost effortlessly. And there is no single correct way to build a board. That freedom is a huge part of the appeal. You can go minimal. You can just do 2 meats and a cheese. Or you can go all out with 10 different components, touching every single flavor profile that exists. One of my personal favorites is you can build around a theme, a season, even a mood. There are no rigid rules, and so people feel encouraged to experiment. And the experimentation is what keeps charcuterie exciting. And I say charcuterie a lot right now, but this is more talking about the charcuterie boards and tables that you can build, where it's more a charcuterie and cheese board or a charcuterie and cheese table. The actual word has begun to be synonymous with the tables and the boards, whereas at its purest form, charcuterie means cooked flesh. So saying the word, and I've said this in a few other episodes, can get overused in ways that it is not intended to be. If you have a vegetable platter, that is not a charcuterie tray, that is a crudité platter. Or if you have a cheese board with some pickles, that is not a charcuterie board, that is a cheese board. So the difference is subtle, but when you talk to professionals or people who are familiar with the food in this industry, saying the correct terms will gain you a lot of bonus points to your knowledge and education. Over the last few years, people have become more interested in where their food comes from and how it's made. And charcuterie can help with that because it does tell a story. Every meat has a specific process, whether it's cured, fermented, how it's aged, how long it's aged, and every region has traditions on each of those steps of the process. Every product reflects time, technique, and the environment it comes from. When you put all of those products on a board, you're sharing pieces of that story. And that's where charcuterie starts to overlap with what I do as a cheesemonger. Because once someone gets curious about the meat, the next question is almost always, well, what cheese goes with this? Sometimes it's a very tricky question because the cheese that pairs best with that particular meat the person might be holding might be a cheese that they despise. And that is where the pairing starts to come into play, where you have to really figure out what cheeses can go with what meats on a chemical level, and then what cheeses go with what meats on just an everyday enjoyment level. And there truly is no right or wrong pairing. If it is 2 pieces of food that you like to eat together, that's a perfect pairing. But if you're going to ask for my recommendation, I will give you one. And if it is a cheese you don't love, I'll have 4 or 5 more ready to go. We will find you that perfect cheese to go with your piece of salami or prosciutto or coppa or whatever you're holding. That's just how I do it in my store. But this does lend to charcuterie becoming a gateway into the larger artisan food area of any grocery store or cheese shop or artisan food store. And yeah, charcuterie is pretty trendy, but it's also very functional. It's approachable and it's endlessly adaptable. And I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. I think it's only going to get more and more integrated into everyday life. Now, to get into what I would call the fun part, we're going to imagine building a board right alongside me. And I'm not going to be just naming meats and cheeses here. I'm going to talk about why they work, how they taste together, and how you can start thinking when you build your own pairings. All right, let's start simple. Prosciutto is often the gateway into charcuterie for a lot of people because it's delicate, it's silky, and it quite literally can melt on your tongue. Now, there is a gentle saltiness, but it's not aggressive. It should be more refined. Now, when you pair that with something like a fresh mozzarella, the mozzarella brings in a sort of soft, milky, creamy neutrality that smooths everything out, where the prosciutto and mozzarella might be something where it kind of balances out the salt with the creaminess of the milky cheese. You can also go the opposite way. You can put prosciutto with a Parmigiano Reggiano, and that is like a salt on salt soft, silky meat meets crunchy, hard cheese. That's also a really fun pairing. Next, onto something a little more robust, you could look at classic salami. It's going to be a little fattier, a little richer, and you'll often get notes of garlic or black pepper, maybe even a little fermentation, depending on how it was made. And I would think you need a cheese that stands up to that. And for me, aged cheddar does that. It stands up to the funk of some classic salamis. And the aged cheddar has a sharpness. If it is aged well, it should have a slight crumble, maybe even those tyrosine crystals, and that should cut right through the fat of the salami. When you eat them together, it's a classic pairing that neither one disappears into the other one. They just hold their own and they make each other better being next to each other. Sopressata is a more intense salami. It's usually coarser in texture, often spicier, and it just has a little more to it. And I think if you pair that with a simpler cheese like a provolone, again, that's going to create a really nice balance. Provolone has this mild tang and a smooth, elastic texture that kind of reins in the spice without muting it. So instead of the heat overwhelming your palate, if it is a spiced sopressata, it becomes something you can enjoy bite after bite. Now, here's a meat that may or may not be available all across the country, but jamon serrano is all about depth. It's dry cured, it's aged, and it develops this nutty, almost buttery complexity over time. And I think you could pair that with a manchego, which is one of those classic regional combinations that just works. And the reasons for that are similar to the prosciutto and Parmigiano Reggiano. The manchego brings a firm texture and a slightly salty, and it is a sheep's milk cheese, so it has the sheep's milk richness that mirrors the ham, but without copying it one to one. They do amplify each other, not necessarily just existing next to each other. Next, we can look at chorizo, which is a bold, smoky, cured, paprika-heavy meat, and it has this deep red color that already tells you that you're in for something a little different than the other meats we've talked about. And pairing it with mahone, I would say would be a nice move here. A mahone has this like buttery quality, but also a slight tang and saltiness that helps balance out the smokiness. It doesn't fight the chorizo, it amplifies it. And you still get all that bold flavor. I think pairing it with the mahone, it will make it feel more of a rounded bite. Capicola up next is seasoned pork shoulder. And what makes it interesting is that it sits somewhere in between delicate and bold. There is a little bit of a spice, but it shouldn't be overpowering. And there is fat, but it shouldn't be as heavy as salami since the capicola is a whole muscle, whereas the salami is a ground meat or a forced meat muscle. For the capicola, what if we were to pair that with fontina, which I think could be a great match here because it leans earthy, a little smoother. It fills in and connects the spice and the richness into something more cohesive. And for me, capicola and fontina on like a nice Italian sandwich with some fresh herbs and spices and maybe some olive oil, that is a good time. Next, we can look at mortadella, which is weird for some people, but think of like fancy bologna, which I'm sure people who make it would say that's not a best way to describe it. But for the average Joe, that's a pretty good one, that's a good way to describe it. It is almost bologna-like in texture, and it's often studded with pistachios, and that adds little pops of flavor and texture and color throughout the meat. And if you were to pair that with burrata, I think you would be doing a good thing. You double down on the creaminess here. The burrata with the hard outer shell, but once you cut into it, the rich cream and mozzarella shreds paired with the mortadella together, it's going to feel very decadent. Next up is one of my favorites is speck. And speck brings smoke to prosciutto. It adds a more refined way to eat prosciutto when you do smoke it. And I think that gives it very many layers because you get the salt, the smoke, the touch of sweetness. Depending on who makes it, it might be a little firmer, might be a little, almost have like little crunchy bits. For speck, I would think like a Gruyere is a natural fit. Since the Gruyere has a nutty, slightly sweet profile, I think that would complement the smokiness of the meat without overpowering it. And when you eat them together, you get a almost cozy, like mountain style flavor combination that could take you back in time. Because Gruyere as an Alpine style cheese, and then the smoked prosciutto, which is definitely built for lasting long winters, eating them together, you can almost put yourself in the middle of a winter in a cabin on a mountain. And that is just so fun to just put them in your mouth, eat them, and then close your eyes and imagine you're somewhere far off in the past. This one I'm probably going to say incorrectly, but bresaola or brezola is the beef component that you don't typically see in charcuterie meats, but it is just as important as the pork products we've already talked about. Brezola is air dried, lean, and it should be incredibly delicate. The flavor is subtle, slightly sweet, and should be very clean and straight to the point. You should know what you're eating is beef. And again, you could pair it with Parmesan, but I think that works because the Parmesan just regular could bring a little more of an umami or like a deep savory quality to the bite. And the Brezola provides the depth almost. This isn't going to be a crazy pairing. I'm sure there's better ones out there. I don't eat this a ton. It's not what a lot of my customers have asked for, so it's not something I've really played with. But when I have had a chance to eat it, it is is delightful. When I've had the chance to try it, I used to pair it with nuts quite a bit, like a Marcona almond or even a caramelized nut would be really nice here. And finally, pate, which is rich, spreadable, and often made from liver, which gives it a deep, mineral, almost earthy flavor. This is a strong category of charcuterie that you will see on fairly elevated boards, and the pairings are almost limitless. But I think if you did a brie, it would round out some of the deep funk of which the pate could be providing, depending on the flavoring of it. Brie being creamy, slight mushroomy already, it is a pretty approachable cheese. And I think it will help soften the intensity of the pate, making it more accessible, especially for people who might be trying it for the first time. This is a great example of using cheese to bridge the gap for someone's palate. And when you step back and look at all these pairings, there is a bigger picture we're kind of talking about. Each one is built on a different layer or a different level of balance. You have the salt with fat, you have the salt with salt, you have richness with freshness, boldness with restraint. And I did a pairing episode a while back where I talked about this a little better, but once you start recognizing the patterns between foods and the ones that you like and you don't like, you can start to kind of build your own pairings in your mind with much, much more confidence. Now, for anyone who just wants to get better at tasting food, learning about charcuterie sharpens your palate in a very real, very practical way. When you start tasting cured meats intentionally, you begin to notice things you might have overlooked before. And this is where it all kinds of ties back into cheese. When you're looking for perfect pairings, most often the pairing that you're going to try to add with your cheese will have a meat component. And looking at these cured meats and these smoked meats help you look at things like salt levels or fat content or texture. Is there a spice component? Is it a smoked product? What about the fermentation? And very importantly, I would think the aroma, because smell is a huge part of taste. And a lot of charcuteries, they can have a pretty solid funk to them if they're made correctly. And when I say correctly, that's just maybe a bias talking, but that is a way of making artisan products that would feel at home in any specialty shop. When you pick up a piece of salami or a piece of prosciutto and actually take a second to smell it before you eat it, you start training your brain on recognizing patterns. You might notice the nuttiness or the sweetness or even a sharpness, some slight funk depending on how the meat was cured. And this same skill translates directly to cheese. All of a sudden, you're not just tasting cheese, you're analyzing it and how to move forward with eating it. And you notice how a washed rind smells compared to a bloomy rind. You know, you're picking up on the difference between a young cheddar and an aged cheddar. You're identifying when something is buttery versus tangy or sharp. These are all words that help you describe food. And the more you can describe food, the better you're going to be at making pairings and enjoying it yourself. Charcuterie can kind of be a training ground here because where cheese, sometimes the aromas can be a little muted, but the flavors are strong. Everything about it is strong. And it is a good place to learn how to talk about your food. It gives you a wide range of flavors and textures to work through, often in a single piece of meat. And I think if you can look at the stronger notes on some charcuterie products, it might make it easier to pick up on the more subtle notes of some cheeses. When you start learning how meats and cheeses interact, you begin to think differently about balance. And you can start asking questions like, well, what cuts through the fat? What complements on salt? What softens the intensity? And when you start thinking that way, you can apply it to anything, not just charcuterie boards. For me, it changes how you build meals, how you recommend products, and for me, how I guide customers. And that's kind of the fun part. It can make people happier when you take something they already like and find a way to add onto it to make it even better. Because when you put together a thoughtful pairing and it is geared towards a specific person, they're going to take note of that. Maybe they don't have the language for it yet, but they feel it when they eat it. When someone takes a bite of something and it just clicks, when it feels balanced, it's very satisfying and it makes sense in your head. So the more you explore charcuterie, the more tools you give yourself. Better tasting skills, better pairing instincts, better communication, and ultimately, it's going to be a deeper appreciation for everything you're putting on the board. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about meat and cheese. It's about understanding flavor, sharing and understanding, and creating something that people will genuinely enjoy. Even if that people is just you at 2 a.m. and you took a bunch of stuff out of your fridge and threw it on a plate and called it a charcuterie board, which is perfectly acceptable. We've all done it. Charcuterie, like most good foods, started as survival food, but then it became tradition, and now it's all about artistic creativity and connection. It brings people together in a way that feels effortless, but it's actually built on centuries of knowledge, technique, and care. And when you start to understand that, you can taste more intentionally, you can smell better, you can appreciate, and you can pair more thoughtfully. Every food has a story. Every slice, every wedge, every pairing is a small decision that adds up to a bigger experience. And the more you learn, the more confident those decisions become. And I think that's what's going to make you a better cheese lover or a cheese monger. And I think that's what makes food fun. When I was younger, you would often hear people say, don't play with your food, but I was raised to think that that was acceptable. And I took playing with my food as a child to playing with my food as an adult, but playing with my food now turns into little pieces of edible art. And I think that's a really fun way to incorporate a childlike sense of wonder into the art of charcuterie building. A little cheesy, but again, this whole podcast is a little cheesy. The whole concept of this show is to be just a little cheesy. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. My name is Alex, and this has been the Modern Monger.